Hello, and welcome to the second session of Fighting the Last War. I have with me here distinguished panellists, Ethan Nadelman and Jerry Stimpson and Natalia. Where is Natalia?
She'll be on the screen, I think.
Natalia Novopova?
I'm here.
You're there.
I'm here.
Good, good that you're here. Now, the second session this afternoon is to talk about challenges in making the Fctc an inclusive international framework convention. And in order to do that, I think we need to start off with the fact, what exactly is inclusivity? And now, I think the Fctc, as we heard in the earlier panel, it did actually start off as an inclusive. As Derek showed us, we did. The tobacco industry was invited to talk to the WHO in the early days. Consumers International was also part of the involvement there, which included the voice of consumers, and the public gallery was open to people to watch. But something has happened to that inclusivity as time has gone on. We then looked to the Fctc and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and as both being very similar framework conventions. And they both started out in the same way, negotiated by the world's 193 governments, and they ended up with treaties. And I think from that you can all see, if you turn your television on, COP26 and what's coming from that treaty is evident and aware. But when it comes to COP9 that's coming up from the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, it's not noticeable. Why is it being left out? Why is there no significant media or anything in relation to this particular conference? And that comes back to inclusivity again. And then we look at the Fctc for the third thing, is to look at, it does include harm reduction and it does include human rights. We heard earlier this morning the fact of some of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights giving rights to health, as does the Fctc, which recalls all of these human rights things, the right to health. It even opens with the determined to protect public health. And yet the things that are protecting human health, such as safer nicotine products, are being ignored. And what do we do about bringing that inclusivity back? And lastly, I would say the big elephant in the room is nicotine itself. And part of the challenge, as we're going to hear from these speakers, is also covering nicotine. If you are going to be inclusive in this debate going forward, it is important that everybody truly understands nicotine, its importance, and why it is relevant. And I think there is, as many of us know, a lot of confusion between nicotine content in a bottle and nicotine absorption and delivery. And in order to have inclusivity and equality in the debate, everybody needs to know and understands these terms. So with that sort of opening in mind, we will start with Ethan Nadelman. And Ethan, as many of you know from having read his bio, he's taught at Princeton and Harvard. He's been a drug harm reduction activist since the 1980s. He started the Drug Policy Alliance. His TED Talk on why we need to end the drug wars has received huge acclaim, and he's just starting a podcast called Psychoactive with Ethan Nadelman, which I'm sure you'll all want to tune into. So without any further ado...
Okay, Jeannie, thank you.
Nathan.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking on this issue of tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction. So let me just start off by saying I'm no expert on Fctc. I'm not going to come up with special, here's how we deal with this or WHO that. The reason I've been invited to some of these gatherings is because of my decades of experience in drug policy reform and advocacy for harm reduction with respect to the illicit drugs. And one of the reasons, maybe the dominant reason, I mean, I've always been sort of sympathetic to a harm reduction approach across the board. It just makes sense. You know, to me, harm reduction is a pragmatic approach. Harm reduction is the place where public health and human rights intersects. Harm reduction is fundamentally consistent with, you know, common sense, science, public health, compassion, you name it. And that also holds true of tobacco. And so I've always been generally sympathetic to it and kept my eye on it. But you know, a few years ago, Jerry invited me to his Global Forum on Nicotine in Warsaw in 2017. And I had to look more deeply at this issue. And what struck me about this issue is that so much about it reminded me of what got me interested and engaged in the struggle for drug policy reform back in the late 1980s, which was really the height of the drug war, certainly in the US, and to some extent the height of the global drug war. And you know, back then in the 80s, as I was a graduate student and assistant professor, and I was studying and reading and writing and interviewing people in government and all of this sort of stuff, and what struck me was that the more deeply you read, the more deeply you studied this issue, you realize that the science, the economics, the public health, the human rights all suggested that drug policy should be going in this direction, towards a reduced reliance on criminalization, more intelligent reliance on regulatory approaches, you know, acceptance that people use drugs and we have to reduce the harm. But meanwhile, the public, including the elite opinion and the media, and the politicians, not just the conservatives and the reactionaries, but the people who consider themselves progressive, were all heading in the opposite direction. And it was this huge and growing gulf between what good science, evidence, common sense human rights said should be good drug policy and where, in fact, drug policy was headed, right? Now, I look today at the fight over how to deal with tobacco in our society, in my country and globally, and it seems to me the same thing's going on. The more you read the science, the evidence about tobacco, about now all of these safer nicotine products, about how and what enables people to quit, how addictive cigarettes are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you realize that we should be heading in this direction, in the harm reduction direction, the public health and human rights direction, the science, the evidence-based one. But yet at the same time, we see everything moving the other direction in public opinion and media, right, and government. And what's particularly galling for me, as somebody who's played a leading role in drug policy reform efforts in the US and to some extent around the world, many of the same political figures who were my allies on advocating and ultimately winning battles to legalize medical marijuana, marijuana for all adults, needle exchange programs, methadone maintenance, harm reduction approaches, safe injection, reduced incarceration, reduced criminalization, they're the ones sometimes leading the charge for bans on safer nicotine products, for bans on e-cigarettes and what have you. And it makes me wonder how true their real convictions were to some extent in this. Now, I know that part of the problem of what's going on here is that you have this variable that's somewhat different now, right? Which is with illicit drugs, you know, there were the big evil narcos out there as there are today. But, you know, they weren't playing, I mean, they were supplying the market, they were corrupting governments, but they were analogous to, but somewhat different from the role that big tobacco and to some extent the other nicotine-producing firms that are legal today are playing. Yet at the same time, there's this way in which, you know, I have to say I'm really impressed at how savvy the tactics have been of what I would call the tobacco prohibitionists, of the anti-nicotine fanatics. Because what they've done is to sort of create a catch-22, right? Where there is essentially at this time, you know, they know that they cannot win on the evidence. They know they cannot win the public health argument. They know they cannot win from a human rights perspective. Therefore, what they are engaging in, and by the they I'm talking about here, especially coming from the US, Michael Bloomberg and his funding and his money in this area. And the guy's done a lot of good on broader public health and even harm reduction with illicit drugs and overdose prevention and a lot on tobacco control and anti-smoking. So God bless him for all the good work he's done there. But when you saw him make that commitment a few years ago, you know, on national television in the US, committing $160 million to ban, he said he wanted to ban flavored vaping, but in point of fact, he was also at times quoted as saying he wanted to ban all vaping, right? And then you see him being interviewed, and why you do this? Well, every parent in America should know, he said, that if your child vapes, they could lose 5 or 10 points off their IQ. Really? Now, where'd you get that one from? Now, then I looked at some of his rhetoric, and I realized that Bloomberg was a bit of an anti-marijuana fanatic as well. You know, it was what caused him to support policing policies in New York that resulted in 50 to 60,000 young men of color being arrested each year for simply having a little marijuana in their pocket. It was probably one of the major variables which caught up with him when he wanted to run for president and kept him from going any further in that regard. But when you look at, you know, he was basically taking the old anti-marijuana rhetoric about the adolescent brain, about the gateway theory, each of which might best be described as an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bullshit, right? And he was applying it to the area of tobacco and alternatives to tobacco. So this raised a fundamental question for me. So here you have somebody who is essentially an ideologue on this issue. He is somebody who, when you look at the science, is anti-public health, anti-human rights, right? I mean, that person, yet that same person is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to ban flavored and maybe all vaping. That same person is given at least, I think, almost over $100 million to the foundation associated with the World Health Organization, over $100 million, you know, to the foundation associated with the Center for Disease Control in the United States. And it raises the question, what does conflict of interest mean, right? Now, on the other hand, I see with respect to big tobacco, right, you now have an almost McCarthyist-like approach. And for those of you in London who don't know what I'm talking about, Joe McCarthy, the famous fanatical anti-communist in America in the early 1950s, and they held congressional hearings, and the question was, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, right? And they demonized and they persecuted all sorts of people, you know, from teachers to politicians to members of the State Department, the military, you name it. But this guilt by association of any way, regardless of who that person really was, regardless of their accomplishments. And so I now see what's going on is I'm engaging in this area as sort of a kind of with fresh eyes, coming from the illicit drug area. I'm meeting these remarkable academics in the US, UK, and other countries around the world, many of them who were real champions and leaders in fighting against big tobacco and smoking and all the duplicitous and evil activities they engaged in throughout the 20th century and into the even into this century. And if any one of them takes a penny from any form of a big tobacco company or even a vape company that's poised against big tobacco or even a foundation that's associated with it, they are being smeared, character assassination, as if they're no different than the hack scientists who worked for big tobacco some decades ago trying to prove that cigarettes were not addictive and that they weren't dangerous. Right? I mean, that is a McCarthyist-like tactic being pursued with major organizations and sometimes in the US government, right, with Bloomberg's funding. Right? So I'm looking at where is the true conflict of interest here. To me, question one can, you know, and it sort of, it's scary because when you talk about conflicts of interest, people can be so simplistic-minded about it, like, oh, did you do that? Did you take that money? What have you? But in point of fact, when you take people who've spent their lives fighting against big tobacco, fighting to reduce the harms of tobacco in our society. And now you see the tobacco control community splitting between tobacco control advocates who see harm reduction as playing a very important role in reducing the harms of tobacco. And on the other hand, tobacco control advocates, all of whom were allied some decades ago in opposing big tobacco, but this other group is now shifting the goalposts, shifting the priorities from being against smoking and against tobacco in the bigger way to being like essentially trying to create a nicotine-free society, what we would call the abstinence-only ideologues when we're dealing with the illicit drug area. Now, I flip back now to my illicit drug background and stuff like this and how we moved. I didn't mean to put it that way, my illicit drug background. My involvement in advocacy around trying to change policies around illicit drugs. You know, we had to be clever about the tactics we pursued. You know, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the notion that we might begin to embrace harm reduction policies in a majority of the countries around the world, the notion that marijuana might actually become legally available and we would just stop arresting people for it, the notion that we would reverse these trends, I mean, all of that just seemed quixotic. It seemed quixotic, as in some respects, right now, the battle for tobacco harm reduction globally seems a bit quixotic, right? I mean, here we are in the UK, one of the few governments that, at least relatively speaking, is good on this issue. but where you have, a U.S. government, you have governments from around the world, even governments which see harm reduction, benefiting them. Sweden, where snus has been such a, really fantastic contribution in reducing the harms of smoking, will not provide leadership on the harm reduction thing. You look at Japan or Korea or other countries where IQOS and similar devices are resulting in dramatic drops in smoking, right? And once again, these governments will not represent it. It's a little bit, so all you have are the more repressive-minded governments that are really out there pushing constantly and caught up in this thing that we can't support harm reduction because big tobacco is supporting harm reduction. Well, come back to basic principles, right? The core, the essence of harm reduction, right, is in some respect the acceptance in the illicit drug area that there's never been a drug-free society. There's never going to be a drug-free society. Therefore, objectives should not be to get rid of drugs or to try to build a moat or, between ourselves and these drugs or our children and these drugs, because that can't be done. Rather, the challenge is to learn how to live with drugs so they cause the least possible harm and, in some cases, the greatest possible benefit. That's the essence of harm reduction. Well, now put that over on the tobacco issue, right? Tobacco, we know something about tobacco. It's an incredibly powerful, addictive, compelling substance, right? That not only hooks people in all sorts of ways, but also gives some people pleasures and things that they enjoy and somehow enhances many people's lives, even if you keep smoking it long enough, it's a 50% chance it's going to kill you. Right? We know it took off like wildfire when it came out of the Americas into Europe and around the rest of the world. There was something compelling about this substance, right? We know that, that even as Will pointed out earlier this morning, that even as the percentage of the world population that smokes has declined, we're still stuck at that kind of billion-plus people smoking every year. Not to mention the hundreds of millions of others using tobacco in a very unhealthy oral form in India and other lower-income countries. Therefore, I don't see us moving in the direction of a nicotine-free society. It seems to me the objective has to be to accept that tobacco is here to stay. And that while there were societies in the past that didn't know about tobacco prior to the 1700s, it's highly unlikely that we're going to evolve into a tobacco or nicotine-free world. And that therefore the challenge is to learn how to live with tobacco and especially nicotine so it causes the least possible harms and in some cases the greatest possible benefits, right? That seems like the pragmatic strategy, right? Now, I flash back an illicit drug thing. I remember 1998, the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. And what was the motto of the UNGAS around drugs in 1998? A drug-free world. We can do it. It just sort of makes you wonder what they were smoking when they came up with that slogan, right? We will cut opium production worldwide by 50%. Well, we're 23 years past that date and it ain't happened. In fact, quite the opposite. It was a ludicrous objective. And we also know that the pursuit of that objective has generated, illicit black markets worth hundreds of billions of dollars each year. It's empowered criminal organizations and corrupted governments and led to massive levels of homicide and violence. It's resulted in drugs being more dangerous than they otherwise would be. It's helped spread HIV and Hep C and all of the negative consequences that flow from a heavily criminalized prohibitionist approach to drugs. We know that that's what's happened as a result. And the drug policy reform movement has been trying to roll that back to remove marijuana and now psychedelics from the global prohibitionist framework, to push for decriminalization of all drug possession, to push for more regulatory approaches, so that we can begin to move these drugs out of a prohibitionist framework. They call it a global drug control framework. It's not, right? What we know is that prohibition does not represent the ultimate form of control. Prohibition represents the abdication of control. And that's essentially what we've had is a drug market, illicit drug market that's been out of control. And therefore to pull these things out and to try to reduce, to decriminalize, to deprohibit the system, not by going towards a free market, but towards a sensible, mindful public health approach that reduces the cumulative harms of drugs, right? Well, the same thing has to be true with nicotine. When we see governments that are banning e-cigarettes around the world, right? When we see all of the other, whether it's the flavored things or maybe all vaping devices, all of these measures, first of all, there is going to be a black market for these things. And we know that people are going to adapt in ways that are going to be harmful to their health and are ultimately going to be, non-beneficial, right? So it seems to me that the challenge is how do we somehow maybe, well, the slogan, the best defense is oftentimes a good offense, right? When people are attacking foundations and others, or researchers and academics for taking money from big tobacco, when there is almost no government sources and no independent philanthropists in the way that George Soros or some others played that role with illicit drug harm reduction beginning in the 1990s, the other side, the antis, have us in a catch-22. But the question is, when people have proved their bona fides, is it legitimate to discredit them solely because they are taking money from that source? And conversely, when an ideologue is providing overwhelming money to pursue an anti-public health policy, do they need to be called out persistently for doing that, right? So I'm just going to finish up by saying these last couple of things. As Jeannie alluded to before, the big elephant in the room here, I think, really is the future of nicotine. It is the future of nicotine. And the biggest obstacle, I think, that those who favor, and when I say tobacco harm reduction, I'm talking about people who favor tobacco control in which harm reduction plays an important role. The biggest obstacle right now is the huge majority of people who believe that nicotine is far more dangerous than it is. In American polls, you see majorities believe that nicotine is what causes cancer, or why cigarettes cause cancer. A majority of doctors even believe that, believe it or not, as if they never learned the science, right? We have now in America, majority of people believe that e-cigarettes are as or more dangerous than cigarettes, right? We have a majority of people who believe that what happened a couple of years ago with the whole E-Valley thing, with people, people landing up in the hospitals with these lung diseases and 50 or so dying and thousands being hurt, which happened to be about illicitly produced tainted THC cartridges that people were vaping, had nothing to do with e-cigarettes. So there's massive misinformation which is propagated with the support of Michael Bloomberg and his foundation, but also the US CDC, as well as politicians who should know better, some of whom actually do know better and some who don't, right? But that issue is when we look down the road and say, what's the big game here at stake? On some level, what we're talking about is, do we want to persist in a world where probably 1 billion people continue to smoke for decades? The proportion of the population will decline that smokes, but roughly 1 billion people continuing to smoke for decades to come? Or a world in which the number of people who smoke tobacco and consume it in other very dangerous forms drops dramatically, but where the number of people consuming nicotine in safer forms, but that doesn't mean 100% safe, it just means safer forms, is 1 billion, 1.5 billion, or 2 billion. What's the end game of the vape companies and big tobacco? They don't want to eliminate the market for nicotine. They want to shift people now into continuing to consume their products, but at least in a healthier form that continue to serve their bottom line, right? Now, it seems to me that's the big name of the game. So long as people are fundamentally misinformed and miseducated about the realities of nicotine, there's no real way for the harm reduction movement to move all that much further. That has to be corrected, and that's a public education effort. Now, how do you do that? I'll finish off by saying this, one of the things, I'm going to California next week where we'll celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first medical marijuana initiative, right? And that was something that, if you ask the question, how was it that the United States, which for almost a century was the evil empire of the global drug war, nonetheless became the leading pioneering champion of ending the criminalization of cannabis? Well, a good part of the answer has to do with the strategy we figured out 25 years ago, which was by starting off with the incremental step of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, right? And moving forward and using that issue to help transform the broader understanding of what marijuana was and who the marijuana consumer was and what the science was. And, as people began to understand that people could use marijuana for beneficial purposes, it began to be less demonized, a little more accepted, and all this. Financial interest did not play any big role in the marijuana reform movement until just 4 or 5 years ago. Almost all the major breakthrough success was done without their role whatsoever. And so there needs to be innovative strategies, outside the box strategies, at helping people rethink nicotine. There needs to be a much greater investment and push one way or another in terms of looking at the positive benefits for nicotine, right? Whether it's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or the whole host of other diseases. You know, if one has to look at the medicalization of nicotine, and this might be an issue where, you know, tobacco control can unite element, you know, some elements of medicalization that might help provide a movement towards greater acceptability. But one way or another, we have to move away from the notion. We have to challenge the basic abstentionist mindset and prohibitionist mindset of trying to create a nicotine-free world. Because I got to tell you, I'll be damned if after having spent decades of my life rolling back the war on drugs and the criminalization of various illicit drugs in my country, that I'm going to go to my deathbed watching a brand new drug war spreading around the world in which the new target of prohibitionist policies and police agencies, it happens to be nicotine and tobacco products. And my fear is we could indeed land up in that direction. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I think the analogy with McCarthyism is something that we should all take away, because when you said that, I started to think, yeah, that's spot on. So we all should probably go out back and read The Crucible and understand a bit more about what we're dealing with, because I think that's there. So let's now go to Natalia Toropova, who is from the Ukraine. Natalia, you can read her bio, but has had a background in tobacco control, worked with Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and others, and is going to talk to us today about the journey from tobacco control to tobacco harm reduction. So over to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here with you. I do wish I were there in person, but hopefully better days are yet to come. I'm delighted to join the discussion on fighting the last war. I don't like wars, but I realize that very often fighting for the principles, for something we believe in, we have to enter all kinds of wars. And whether we win it or lose it, that depends on us, and to a large extent on our personal or professional journeys, the one that we choose. When I think of mine, I realize I always wanted my journey to be meaningful, to have an impact, to make the world more prosperous, more successful, and people's lives more easier, joyful, longer, and healthier. In my teen years, I wanted to become a surgeon. I really was determined to do that. I wanted to go some hard places, maybe war zones, to help people, save their lives. But sadly, that was not meant to happen. Before that, when I was 4 or 5 years old, I had a wonderful dream of becoming a princess. But sadly, that didn't work out either. So I decided to focus on something more meaningful, something very important and rewarding. And that is advancing public health, specifically advocating for tobacco control, because smoking-related diseases and deaths can be and should be prevented. That means that we could change the grim reality around us. And if we can change it, then why don't we? By the way, I don't think I left tobacco control. I think that right now I'm actually in the real tobacco control, the one that is about saving lives, because it's focusing on the harm reduction strategy. And this strategy is about saving lives, providing healthier choices. What is the real tobacco control about? It's about actions we have to take to fight cardiovascular diseases, to prevent cancers. That would mean saving lives. We all know that 8 million people worldwide die annually of tobacco-related diseases. In Ukraine, this number is 85,000. In the Russian Federation, every year, 320,000 people prematurely die of tobacco-related diseases. In fact, in Russia, 18% of all deaths are caused by smoking combustible cigarettes. Now, who are all these people who die today? They are the adult smokers who would love to quit, but cannot, because they're not provided professional assistance or proper guidance. These are chain smokers who are addicted and cannot quit using only their willpower because they do not know of healthier options. There is no objective information or unbiased full information, especially in this part of the world. A couple of months ago, my great friend almost died, 40 years old. He had a stroke. He's been a chain smoker for 20 years. You cannot imagine how many times he tried to quit and how many times he failed because he had no idea, no clue about healthier options on harm reduction products that were around him. He was trying to get help, but he could not get it. Luckily, he made it. He is alive. But that made me think of other chain smokers like my friend who were not that lucky, who did not make it. How many of them would not make it today, would not make it tomorrow? That means we have to raise the level of ambitions in tackling tobacco-related diseases. This is what the real tobacco control should be about. And we all should be more passionate about that. Yes, we do know that resources in low middle income countries are stretched. We do realize that countries with weak legislative system, with weak enforcement system, are not that successful in helping adult smokers quit. But still the reality when the whole approach to tackling that tobacco epidemic is based on the victim blaming principles, when smokers are neglected, stigmatized, that has to be changed. This whole reality is the one that should not be accepted. For instance, a few months ago, our organization did a survey in Ukraine, aiming to see how many adult smokers actually today are willing to quit and try to quit. The results were quite encouraging. Turned out that almost half of the respondents did try quitting over the past year, but 0% of those optimists actually could get professional guidance or medical assistance while trying to quit. Now, how depressive is that? And yet, I don't see WHO or here talking loudly about this issue. I don't notice any tobacco control groups expressing their deep concern about this matter either. And no one can solve the problem simply by ignoring it. One has to act. It's true that WHO has done a lot to prevent kids from smoking in the past, having implemented a number of WHO Fctc measures. And I personally have contributed to that over many years in many countries. This is very good. However, that doesn't mean that one should become manipulative about this issue. We all understand that when we talk about kids' lives and health, this all is very emotional. However, let's try to say a little bit beyond this matter. If it would take up to 40 years from now, if all of a sudden all kids today stop smoking, 40 years, that's a lot. However, if we really want to tackle cancer, cardiovascular diseases, let's say in a feasible future, 10 years from now, we have to focus on smokers today, those who need help now, providing them with all possible resources available so they can quit. And these resources, as we all understand, are right here. However, instead, I find myself in a very strange reality of twisted facts, massive disinformation campaign about harm reduction products, when the focus has been completely shifted from the real tobacco control. Sadly, it's no longer about saving lives, nor it is about tackling smoking as a #1 risk factor for non-communicable diseases. It's purely about attacking harm reduction products. This is not what the real tobacco control should be about. And this reality should not be accepted. It must be addressed with a new reality completely different, where smokers are respected and not stigmatized, where they are cared for and provided help by their doctors, where economic incentives to help smokers switch to harm reduction products and quit are available, where governments of the old countries care and healthcare workers actively provide professional guidance. That tobacco control I used to be a part of, unfortunately, does not exist anymore. It has stepped away from science, from world best practice, and is now based on one single cliche used for all countries, based on demonizing harm reduction products, equalizing them in every possible form and shape with combustible cigarettes, telling lies. And that happens in every country, presenting harm reduction products as a Trojan horse, undermining the tobacco control efforts. This is happening now, today, when science is clearly telling us that, on the contrary, harm reduction products are promoted, should be promoted as an effective way to combat smoking, to win users away from smoking combustible cigarettes, and thus opening a way for them towards better future, creating opportunities for making healthier choices. And I think this is exactly what we should focus on if we want to win this war, and nothing should discourage us. That won't be easy, but I'm sure we all can meet the challenge and win. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. I think that was a very interesting, outline of the fact that things have changed from a desire to protect health to sort of being ideologically driven, and some of the no longer is there that scientific basis driving things. I think that's a very interesting storyline that you took us through for that transition that you experienced. So now let's turn over to Professor Jerry Stimson, who is a professor of sociology associated with Imperial College and the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, as well as a leading advocate during the 1980s and continues on drug harm reduction, and very significant in bringing that about in the UK, and of course involved in setting up this very conference. So over to you, Jerry, to talk about what we've learned, what we have learned and what is next for tobacco harm reduction.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. I didn't know in 2010 that I was entering into a crazy world of tobacco control. I'd spent, as Jeannie indicated, a lot of my life working on drugs harm reduction. I became interested in tobacco harm reduction around 2008, 2009, 2010, and I thought, well, wow, here is the solution to the world's smoking problem. I think it ticks all the boxes. It's all this kind of world health and public health boxes in helping people to change, putting control in the hands of people. And it seemed to be such a simple solution. And I thought, well, wow, all my public health colleagues are going to agree with me. But I soon found out that even though many of them were pro-drugs harm reduction, pro-drug law reform, when it came to tobacco, there was another hat, very different beast. So some of those friends of mine who'd been very active and taken great risks in pursuing drugs harm reduction, when it came to tobacco and safer nicotine products, very different view. And it's a crazy world. I mean, I thought I was heading for I've retired a couple of times, and my last retirement was 2010. I'm not sure when my next will be, but all my team say I should never retire. But since 2010, there's really sort of strange things happened. I mean, I find myself on a WHO blacklist. I find myself with an entry in Tobacco Tactics, the University of Bath Tobacco Tactics website. And of course, amongst our friends, if you have an entry there, you're doing the right thing. And there are some people in the room who are saying, why don't I have my own entry on the Tobacco Tactics website? Anna Gilmore, please give me my page. And there are the niggles and the hurts. I've got friends who are banned from speaking to me because I'm working in tobacco harm reduction and I'm funded by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. There are people who are banned from coming to the Global Forum on Nicotine for that reason. I mean, this is pretty crazy. So there are many groups trying to stop tobacco harm reduction. They will slow it and there are setbacks, but I think the end of combustion is in sight for tobacco, just as it is for fossil fuels. I mean, THR is being driven by three things: the new nicotine technologies, consumer interest, and good regulation. Those are the three drivers. And perhaps that's why public health has a problem with this, because public health is quite happy. I mean, I was a left-leaning public health social scientist, all that stuff that I had to leave behind a little bit. But, public health is sort of happy in telling what people are doing, then getting a bit annoyed when they don't do it, but feels very uncomfortable when people start doing things without being asked to by public health. And I think that's one of the issues here, the sort of lack of ownership by public health and by the medical establishment, because it came from a very different direction which they couldn't easily control, and so the response is to raise the concerns, raise the fears, the FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt. So, positive side, tobacco harm reduction is here for good. It's an easy fix that will have a massive impact on world health. It's a free gift. I mean, it's the companies that meet the R&D expenditure and the manufacturing costs, and it's the consumers who put their hands in their pockets to buy the goods. So it's one of those classic but often unremarked upon health interventions that doesn't require government expenditure. When I was working on drugs and HIV prevention, HIV/AIDS arena, all the time you're trying to persuade governments and foundations and so on to come up with the millions of dollars to launch interventions to help people to change their behaviour. This doesn't need any money at all. Harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction is simple. It requires appropriate, acceptable, accessible, affordable products and regulatory frameworks which ensure product standards. And tobacco harm reduction saves lives. We don't need randomized controlled trials to show that lower risk products lead to less harm, just as we don't need RCTs to prove that avoiding petrol and diesel is better for the environment. Nor do we need to treat smokers for their addiction, just as we don't need to treat people for their addiction to driving cars. So, the sooner we move from harmful to safer delivery systems, the sooner we'll reduce smoking-related harm. But what a mess this has become. I called this talk initially sort of going forwards and going backwards, because some days it looks like we're going backwards, other days there are things that are good, but many days the prospects have looked bleak. The Australian government's bizarre plan makes nicotine for vaping only available on prescription. That's kind of like going to my GP to get a prescription to go to Starbucks, and I don't want to do any of those things. We've got the FDA in the States, which is pursuing a rule-driven bureaucratic nightmare, which is leading to the massacre of nicotine products, of small businesses, and the consumer choice. It seems to me the FDA doesn't understand nicotine vaping products. Several European countries are considering flavour bans and taxes. The WHO continues its campaign against vaping, including scandalous image. I mean, this is kind of kiddie vape porn. Have you seen those WHO images of kids vaping? All this moral panics about kids vaping. The only people who portray kids vaping is the WHO. This is absolutely and the campaign for tobacco-free kids. And it's wholly inconsistent. The WHO position in this field is wholly inconsistent with its adoption of harm reduction for other health issues. The Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, riding on its $160 million from Bloomberg to fight flavors, has succeeded in pushing falsehoods about the supposed danger nicotine poses to America's youth. I don't know what there is about the preoccupation with kids in America. In 1971, my late friend Jock Young coined the term moral panics for these sort of scares about kids and other things. And the US seems to have had recurrent moral panics about kids, whether it was juvenile delinquency or rock and roll or internet screen time, violent video games, and now nicotine. So it's kind of surprising that anybody in the US gets to adulthood unharmed, or maybe they don't. So, and then you've got this foul campaign from the Truth Initiative. I mean, anybody who calls an organization the Truth Initiative and hasn't read 1984 needs to go back to that book, to the Ministry of Truth, or go to Russia and Pravda, a newspaper called Truth, completely the opposite. Calling something the Truth Initiative, and they now have this foul campaign, the fake product called Depression Sticks. It's a false account, it presents depression sticks, a vapor device, falsely claims that nicotine causes mental illness. This campaign harms young people. It's muckraking fantasy. So what a mess these organizations have created. I hope that one day there'll be class actions against these organizations from people forced back to smoking because of this propaganda. But it's not all good news. Not all bad news. Did I say good news? It's not all bad news. There is some good news. Despite all the discussion about bans, the number of countries banning hasn't really increased. There are 36 countries that ban vaping products. The majority either regulate them or don't do anything. Going forwards, we have, as you've heard from Derek, the FDA issuing PMTAs for general snus, IQOS, and a small number of e-cigarette products, but of course the denial of the marketing orders for many e-cigarette products. And bizarrely, a few days ago, approved a discontinued oral nicotine product. Anyhow, those PMTAs for snus and for IQOS are important. Going forwards, we know that safer nicotine products can become rapid substitutes for smoking cigarettes. Sweden, many years back, reached that 5% smoking rate, which is taken as indicative of the elimination of smoking, and has the lowest tobacco-related mortality in Europe. In Norway, women under the age of 25 have an extremely low rate of smoking. 1% of young Norwegian women smoke, but around 15% of them use snus. It's been a substitution of snus for smoking. Japan, massive decrease in cigarette sales, a drop of around 40% since the introduction of heated tobacco products. And going forwards and looking positive, the UK is progressive, and I think we've succeeded in normalising vaping, but of course we still ban snus. So in London streets, you'll see people vaping rather than smoking. There are vape shops in even the smallest towns. There are no laws preventing vaping in public places. It's up to the owners of premises to decide what to do. But even here, in cricket clubs, they often make the wrong decision. I mean, the wide open space of the Surrey County Cricket Club, of which there are some members here today, you're not allowed to vape out in the wind there because they decided that vaping is somehow incompatible with watching cricket. Drinking isn't. Okay, so not... In the UK, e-cigarettes are controlled by light touch regulation. They're included in the annual NHS Stop Smoking campaigns. A few NHS hospitals have vape shops. There's no moral panic about vaping except amongst a tiny number of public health dinosaurs who've been a bit quiet of late. The number of vapers has increased steadily as the number of smokers has declined. For all that, there are some troubling signs. The recent report for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Smoking and Health, written by Ash and the Spectrum Consortium, has no positive recommendations on e-cigarettes. They're discussed, but none of the recommendations are positive about e-cigarettes. The only recommendation in there, or the two recommendations, one is the ability to ban supposedly kiddie attractive flavours. So what is going on? Because the ash surveys show that e-cigarette use amongst young people is almost absent here. So why is ash importing a moral panic from the US? I don't know what's going on there. So as you've heard, and as we show in our report, anti-THR sentiment globally is nourished by big philanthropy. I don't think it's a kind of a command and control thing that we have to fantasize, but certainly the money goes to those who are anti-THR. And if we can just look at this slide, this photo shows the relationship between WHO and one of the largest funders. As you can see on the slide, it has Bloomberg philanthropist, it says Michael Bloomberg and Dr. Tedros from the WHO against a backdrop of Bloomberg philanthropists and WHO logos. You can't see the slide because
It's not yet showing.
I know it's not showing because we're not allowed to show it. We use the photograph. The next slide, please. We've got a cartoon of it done by our cartoon team in Warsaw. We use the photo. There's a photograph on WHO social media, shows Tedros and Bloomberg shaking hands, both smiling, against a backdrop of logos, Bloomberg Philanthropies, World Health Organization, Empower. And it's used by WHO in promoting their work and their relationships. We've used this photo in the event promotion for today. And a week ago, I had a letter from Bloomberg Philanthropy lawyers threatening legal action if we used the photograph in our work. So these are stupid niggles, stupid nonsenses. And in fact, if you go to page 41 of our report, you can find the link which takes you to the photograph on the WHO Twitter account. So I can't show it to you, but there you go. So there are little stupid niggly attacks like this, but there are malicious attacks as well. I've mentioned the bans on friends speaking to each other. The pseudo-investigative journalists fed money and stories by the Bloomberg-funded groups at the University of Bath and at Vital Strategies. Bath has contracts with journalists on smoking and THR work. It includes what I call academic apartheid, the no platform and the exclusion, and some of it is clearly bonkers. The Centre for Good Governance in Tobacco Control prohibits participation in its events for those with tobacco industry contacts to the 4th degree of consanguinity. Now, you need to look up what is the 4th degree of consanguinity, because it goes sideways to your relatives, but it also goes back. So the 4th degree of consanguinity goes back to your great-great-grandparents. So there's a kind of a transgenerational theory of contamination going on here. My great-great-grandparents were born in the 1820s. I don't even know their names. I had to look it up on Ancestry Plus to clarify what I was saying. I don't even know what they got up to. So this theory that you can't engage with events because of your links with the tobacco industry are clearly mad. There's an event next week, an Fctc report being launched next week. It's announced on Twitter today. You go on there to join the online event. First question, have you got links with the tobacco industry? So what is all this about? You have events and you ban people. We don't do that. We welcome everybody. So this over-interpretation of Article 5.3 from the FCTC is really become a part of a pathology of tobacco control extremists. It's what Clive Bates described as a homeopathic concept of contamination. And unfortunately, many academics are complicit in this. They don't protest these aggressions. I don't know if they're bullied, scared, unwilling to rock the boat, or perhaps they agree wrongly that Article 5.3 applies throughout academic advocacy, work, and private life. So, what of the upcoming Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Conference of the Parties? Well, COP is shrouded in secrecy. It's antipathetic to those companies that are now part of the solution to smoking. paranoid about the public, driven by anti-THR rhetoric in conjunction with the World Health Organization, and steered by a relatively unaccountable secretariat. The Framework Convention itself is wide-ranging. It includes supply, demand, and harm reduction, the neglected area, and it's flexible. Built in is the need to respond to scientific developments. But throughout the history of those meetings, harm reduction has been neglected to such an extent that, in fact, I think now that WHO and FCT have lost ownership of the harm reduction element. As Derek Yak says, the FCT is frozen in time. Many have called for it to be abandoned or significantly revised, but states have no appetite for this. So what has to be on the agenda is change through its interpretation and implementation. First, parties to the convention, the countries that own the FCTC, must press for changes to the 5.3 guidance. Second, FCTC, WHO and COP deliberately ignore that third pillar of the convention, harm reduction, and indeed campaign against it. So I think governments must press COP to give harm reduction its rightful place as is mandated in the convention in 1D. Third, there's a lack of transparency. There are two framework conventions. There are only two framework conventions. One is on climate and the other is on tobacco. And the contrast between the climate COP26 event next week and FCTC COP9 is stark. The head of the FCT Secretariat has just tweeted about the parallels between the COP, the FCTC COP and the climate COP, saying that we're both battling big industry. But what she forgets is how different the FCTC COP is from the climate COP. If you go onto the climate COP website, it invites you to get involved. Most of the proceedings are online. 2,500 organizations are admitted as observers to the climate COP. FCTC COP has just 21 observer organizations, and there are attempts to join as observers, and only today we heard that NNA's bid to get observer status was rejected, along with the International Network of Nicotine Consumer Organizations. But admitted as an observer is the Tobacco Control Research Group at the University of Bath. So consumers no, anti-THR people, yes. COP observers, as was mentioned this morning, include a whole range of groups, business and industry, farming and agriculture, and so on and so forth. Many of them are exhibitors and sponsors. Most of those groups are welcome at Climate COP. Most of the groups who are welcome at Climate COP are banned from Tobacco COP. So, and as we know, FCTC COP richly excludes the public and the media. And despite being virtual this year, the proceedings are not online. So, things have got to change. Taxpayers pay for COP and for the FCT Secretariat, and the UK here is key, and we've been pressing UK politicians and government to do something there, but it doesn't look very positive. But the fact is that the UK pays 70% of the FCT Secretariat voluntary and project money. And as one MP remarked to me, if we pay that much, why don't we get to appoint the head of the FCT Secretariat? So there's beginning the thinking there that things have got to change, and that the UK, now it's unbound by the Euro bloc vote, can be a force for change. That's what we hope, that UK and other countries can take back control of COP. But the indications in an answer to a parliamentary question last week are that the new minister for this, that, and everything else, the minister in charge of this is adamantly not going to rock the boat this time around at COP. So, I've nearly finished. Before I do that, I'd like to thank Harry Shapiro for writing Fighting the Last War. I'd like to thank all the KAC team who work on this in many different ways and have been involved in producing the report. I'd like to thank Suli Castro for organising this launch, and I'd like to thank the foundation. She's waving at the back. Hi, Suli. And I'd like to thank the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World for funding our work. So, Are we going forwards or are we going backwards? As I say, some days the prospects look bleak, but overall I think the prospects are good. I think tobacco harm reduction is unstoppable. It's being driven by a dynamic of good products and consumer interest. We have to recognize that transformations in tobacco consumption have often taken a very long time. After the advent of the cigarette rolling machine, it took about 50 years for the manufactured cigarette to replace other forms of tobacco consumption. So the question for us is really not whether this transformation to safer nicotine products will happen, but the speed of transition, and of course, the longer it takes, the more deaths. So THR can be slowed, but not prevented. The question, I think, is not whether safer nicotine products will replace cigarettes and other harmful tobacco products, but when. So that's why I like to think that tobacco harm reduction is here for good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for reminding us of moral panic and academic apartheid, and also I think for making the significant point of we can get there. It's onward and upward. It is going in the right direction. And why aren't governments actually doing what they're supposed to do? And I think what you said, Ethan, brings a lot of it into that. They're scared. When Canada spoke up and said, I think we need to keep the public gallery open to the public, no other country in the world supported Canada. That's the sort of thing that needs to change going forward. So we have questions now to the panel. We have quite a lot of them on the monitor. I might start there and then come to questions in the audience. I think the very first question that came in seems to have yes, here it is, from Monica Giorgio, and it's a question to you, Ethan. It's, how do you believe we could adapt the strategies you started 25 years ago at DPA to the tobacco field? What would be possible?
I mean, the first and most urgent thing, I think, is to find philanthropic sources that have no connection whatsoever to the industry. Because that's the taint now. I mean, why, if some of the consumer advocacy groups were able to build some real momentum without to do it with no money whatsoever, then maybe would they have a shot of getting in? We have no idea. But I mean, the role that first a fellow named Richard Dennis and then more substantially George Soros played was in enabling sort of an independent voice. And right now, that's really what's missing. So I think that's a crucial thing right there. I think the second thing is it's really the need to think as strategically as possible about how we evolve. I mentioned before the issue, in suggesting that medical marijuana was the way we got there. I'm not suggesting that the medicalization of nicotine is the way to go there, to the right place, but it is to say that thinking outside the box in terms of strategies that can help shift the imagery of who is the consumer, who is the user, and being as innovative as possible about that. Thirdly, languaging. Sometimes I hear, as I become part of these tobacco harm reduction circles, a kind of us versus them, tobacco harm reduction versus tobacco control. And Harry mentioned this earlier, but we're all involved in tobacco control. And historically, the tobacco control community split, as I said before. But I think it's a mistake to call the other side the tobacco control folks and ourselves the harm reduction folks. We are the tobacco control folks who favor harm reduction as part of a strategy. They are the tobacco control folks who are now turning their back on sensible control, at least as far as it involves current smokers, and becoming prohibitionists and absent ideologues. So I think attention to language is really important. The other thing is, in talking about, one thing we realized in dealing with the international drug control system, the treaties beginning 100 years ago to regulate drugs, and the treaties of 36, 61, 70, 88, and then of dealing with the UN agencies, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, the International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND, that basically, the old adage that think global, act local, and all politics is local, that's really what's going to change things in a big way. I think, I tend to advise people, whether you're thinking about, people you want to raise money from, or whether you're thinking about broader strategies, there is no they there. it's about individual opportunities, individual people or foundations when you're thinking about funding. But when you're thinking about opportunities, it's like, where is the government? And there's, did New Zealand do something really innovative that's worth picking up on and running with? Is there an opening in this country in the less developed world? Is there a particular mayor or governor or whatever it might be in your country? Run where the opportunities exist. And recognize there's two sorts of opportunities. One is when allies pop up. I was fortunate when I was just getting going in the late 80s as a professor that the new mayor of Baltimore, a black man, former prosecutor, Rhodes Scholar, Kurt Schmoke, stood up and said the same thing. We became the kind of academic politician duo. Then it was a libertarian-minded Republican governor, Gary Johnson, in New Mexico in the year 1999-2000. And you seize those opportunities. The alternative opportunity that presents itself is when the opposition, the other side, goes too far. When they institute a ban. I remember, we always had a hard time educating people about methadone maintenance and about the science and why that was methadone maintenance properly done is got the best odds of helping somebody who's been in trouble with illegal drugs. And we had a hard time. All the media would always focus on, the people who were getting their methadone and then reselling it, or the ones doing both drugs, or the tragedies of a mother who left her methadone in the fridge and the kid died and stuff like that. And these were, and that's why the public thought about it, and just substituting one addictive drug for another. And then my mayor in the late 90s, Rudy Giuliani, goes, I'm going to ban methadone. And at that point, the U.S. drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, who was no great ally of reform, said, what the hell? And many of the abstinence-only treatment programs, which were not really into methadone at all, said, well, we didn't mean you should get rid of it. And in a way, Giuliani's overreach provided the best public education opportunity we'd ever had. So it's looking for those places where either good folks are running the right way and you can jump onto it and try to elevate, maximize those efforts, or where the other side is overreaching in a way that might, in fact, shock the conscience.
I think overreaching is a really good thing. I mean, that's where we come to a question that's just come in from Australia for you, Natalia, about the overreaching of the Australian government. It's from Andrew Thompson. It says, Australians can now only get nicotine for vape by subscription from doctors. Given their belief nicotine causes cancer, etc., it's failing. Is it really a practical approach to tobacco harm reduction? Do you think that the Australian government's overstepped, to pick up on Nathan's point, in the context of that question?
Asking me?
No, I'm asking. Sorry, I'm looking to the screen behind me rather than in front of me. To
no, it's very hard to, when you're on Zoom, you can't really figure out where people are looking at. Sorry. Well, I can speak for the region of the former Soviet Union, right? And that's unfortunately in the practice of harm reduction, it's a completely different universe. I mean, the experience of Australia is so different for Ukraine. I mean, here, not only people cannot speak of harm reduction products on prescription or just buying them in pharmacies. Here, harm reduction products have a very, very bad reputation because of the unbiased and fake information. For instance, just an example that a couple of months ago, there was this crazy campaign of billboards all over Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, showing a guy with an e-cigarette and saying that e-cigarette gives you black lungs, meaning lung cancer. That's just an example of how twisted, how perverted the campaign is about HRPs here in Ukraine, which is why I think that Australian experience right now is not that relevant to Ukraine in this sense, because I think we are on a little bit, or Russia or Kazakhstan or Georgia. I mean, take any country of the FSC region. I think we're a little bit on a different level right now.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. And I think leading from Russia to Africa, we have a question for you, Jerry, which has a lot of likes, and it's what advice do you give to the African countries whose economies have for decades heavily relied on tobacco production?
Yeah, There are countries in Africa like Malawi where 60% of the foreign earnings come from tobacco, huge proportion of GDP from tobacco. You have the sort of the strange situation that Malawi, for example, they export tobacco and import cigarettes. So the farmers there are going to be in difficulties. So there's clearly parallel in what we're discussion in tobacco harm reduction and safer nicotine products. We should also be interested in agricultural transformation, because what will these farmers now be growing? In fact, there's a growing interest in growing marijuana in many of these countries, transitioning to other products. So there are ways out, but it has to be handled appropriately. But I think the other question for African countries is, what does tobacco harm reduction look like in those countries? What do the products look like? Because a lot of the stuff that we have here, you know, it's expensive, it's fancy, it's driven by electricity. So can you develop local products, local reduced risk tobacco type products, snus type products? And so I think, you know, and bearing in mind in many parts of Africa, it's not just smoking, there's a range of other types of tobacco products. So, and that's something for the companies as well, for the big tobacco companies, because, you know, making money now, you know, Japan and Europe and North America. But, you know, there's an obligation, I think, for them to begin to think about how and what kind of products could work in Africa.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, I think we should go to questions from the audience here. Are there any questions to the panel from the audience? Yes, we have. Oh, we don't? We do.
Front row.
Front row.
Front row.
Front row. Okay, Martin, if you could just say where you're from so people know.
Hi, Martin Cullip, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Jerry was talking about the Truth Initiative and how they don't tell the truth, basically. They came out with a report or a statement on September the 9th last month where, obviously, I think, stung by the fact that everyone's saying that the WHO and all the anti-vaping forces do not recognise harm reduction. So, no, of course we recognise harm reduction. We're very much in favour of harm reduction. And then proceeded to redefine what harm reduction means to them, and said that they're in favour of harm reduction such as NRT, but only if it leads eventually to not using nicotine at all, which is just another way of saying quit or die, in my opinion. So the WHO and all these organisations know what harm reduction is. You know, they don't talk about banning electric cars because it doesn't lead to quitting driving altogether. They know what vaccines are, they know what harm reduction measures are. So they're either refusing to accept what harm reduction is, or they just don't understand what harm reduction is. So how do you make them either accept harm reduction or even understand it?
Well, I think everyone can comment on that. Do you want to start, Ethan?
Yeah, I mean, I think what also Truth was responding to was, I mean, a whole number of things. You know, the possibility that FDA was going to approve this Views product, the e-cigarette product, they did. It was also that wonderful initiative by Ken Warner, you know, remarkably distinguished economist, former dean at University of Michigan School of Public Health, who enlisted a majority of the past presidents of the SRNT, the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, to sign essentially, you know, a publication, American Journal of Public Health, saying that harm reduction needs to be taken more seriously in the public health community. And the SRNT is not seen as a pro-harm reduction organization. So, I mean, that sort of effort that was, or when you look at the article when Cheryl Hilton and a number of others, who was the past president of Truth Initiative when it was pro-harm reduction, when they published in Science. I mean, I think things like that in the academic world, you know, make a real difference. Unfortunately, there's not the consciousness or the funding to take those sorts. That SRNT publication that Ken Warner orchestrated in American Journal of Public Health, that art science, there's no enterprise out there that is putting that out into the public media attention, right? If the advocates for harm reduction had a fraction of the money that Bloomberg's putting into banning, then items like that would get global attention. And because academics don't tend to think about engaging the public in that way, and because there's really not any effective media. I mean, effort, media promotion being done. So that's the real failing. But those initial efforts are definitely a step in the right way. I mean, the other fact, of course, was what, it was really quite remarkable under Trump when, Trump initially wanted to ban, vaping, right? His wife comes home, says, I think our kid's vaping or his friends are vaping, and he, calls the head of Health and Human Services and said, let's ban it, And then what happened was a little orchestrated campaign among Republicans who did some research showing that there were swing voters in key states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, who leaned towards Trump, either were, middle or his way, but who were basically saying, if you screw us and ban vaping, we're not going to vote for you. And launching a campaign, we vape, we vote. And that really made a difference. I mean, one of the books that's just been written about the Trump era, has a little anecdote of Trump blaming his former Health and Human Services Azar for him losing the election because he pushed him on the on that issue. So who knows if it's true, but there are effective aspects of advocacy.
Yeah, Jerry, would you like to comment?
Just briefly, I mean, I think one of the things we should be pleased about is that small vaping organizations, unpaid vaping advocates around the world, a bunch of pro-THR people who share, Gmail lists and so on, who write to WHO from time to time, is having a huge impact. That others are now getting scared about the impact that these groups have had. But I mean, there are probably 70, 80 vaping organizations globally. My guess is that their total income is probably under $100,000. There's a run on a shoestring. Some are relatively wealthy, which might mean a £15,000 a year budget. Most are run by volunteers, 2 or 3 people. But they do make a noise, and that noise certainly helps. But the key issue is, as you all know, is how you can beef that up. I mean, it's only the foundation which is funding the Stop Smoking work, and there's no money going into this. We tried for NNA to get money from Cancer Research UK, and bit difficult that. We prefer to give it to ASH. So nobody's putting that money behind these organisations, and the organisations that do have money are not engaging with vapers. Where are the vapers on the boards of trustees of the anti-smoking organisations? Where are they? They're not there. So a lot's been done with very little money, and if there were the sort of money that could be taken, so much more could be done. But the groups are in a quandary because there is money they could take, but as soon as they take money from e-cigarette companies or whatever, they fall into that trap of being accused of being in the pay of tobacco companies. So I think, a hell of a lot has happened to stave off bad things, and the letters that went before, the activity around the different COPs has been quite interested in almost postponing decisions at COPs. And to my mind, the more noise you can make and the more you can postpone things, which gives time for markets to develop, more people to be vaping and using safer nicotine products. That's kind of an interim position. So, you need to expand the use and try to stave off nasty bits of legislation. But the noise that's being made has had an impact, but could have so much more impact if there were more money.
Thank you, Jerry. Before we go to the next question in the room, Natalia, did you want to comment, or should we go to the next?
Yes, please. Yes, that's actually a very good question, and I often myself think about this. I know that WHO core people, as well as BI team, they do know the power and potential of harm reduction products. They recognize it. They are aware of scientific research. And that makes me very, very sad, because their tobacco control groups in the countries, all over the region, all over Eastern Europe, they're not told the truth. I mean, they genuinely do not know what harm reduction products are, what they can do, what they're capable of. And I think this is very dishonest and also not decent, this kind of behavior. So that actually creates like catch-22, where we, harm reduction products advocates, also find ourselves in. And how to find a way out from this catch-22, that's another puzzle we all have to put together.
Thank you, Natalia. Good point. Now, we've got another question in the room from Derek Yak.
Hi, this is a question for Natalia. Just I think striking how we're seeing the relatively rapid increase in a wide range of harm reduction products, whether it's in Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan. And those stories are not really making it through here to the UK. And this is often happening despite government, what they're doing, but it's driven by consumers and a wide range of companies getting their stuff to market. So my question to you is, what would be most helpful for many of the people, particularly here in the UK, who have incredible knowledge and talent? And I think that I would hope that they would spend less time really sort of on the nicety of UK policy, and rather getting into a plane now that they can and getting out to the countries. And maybe you could talk about the likely response you think they would get by taking the expertise and the knowledge of what is actually happening in the UK and how it could influence policies across the previous countries of the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Derek. That's a very good question. In fact, the example of UK has been very, very popular in Ukraine, in Russia, in the whole former Soviet Union region. Everybody looks up to the UK. However, when it goes to harm reduction products, that's still a very strange issue, and everybody starts questioning it. At the same time, we had lots of meetings with doctors last week, with policymakers, and everybody here in Ukraine was telling that it would be amazing to speak to policymakers in the UK, to speak to key researchers in the UK, to actually see those people and hear from them why tobacco harm reduction products are powerful, what kind of potential they have, why this is the product that doesn't kill, that is not dangerous for kids. Because one thing is when we say it here or write in the newspapers, another thing is it would be very, very, very powerful indeed if they actually hear from the UK people who stand behind HRPs, who stand in the government, in parliament, doctors. As Derek made a very good point today, it's doctors who actually should lead the way. And when smoking prevalence gets declined among doctors, it's a very good sign and a very good encouragement for other kinds of population all over the world. So I think UK can actually play a better role, a brighter role, a more outstanding, as an example, role model for the whole world in promoting harm reduction products.
Thank you, Natalia. I think that's right. Exported regulation or exported best practice is something we don't do really enough of, and I think it's a very good point. Think of what Japan could do to talk about what's happened with heat not burn in Japan. Think of what, yes, the UK could do in other parts of the world, and even what Sweden, if it got its act together, could talk about in terms of what's happened in Sweden in other parts of the world where snus would be a viable product. We have some good questions here, but I think we've got one more here in the room.
Hello, my name's David Skinner. I don't have a dog in this fight at all, so I'd just like to ask the panel, on the theme, or going back to the theme of overreaching, do you consider that there might be a time in the future when a government will ban smoking? And going on from that, if they did, or got close to it with the decreasing numbers of people who do smoke, do you think there may be a time when a government in the future may say to those that are left who do smoke that we will no longer provide healthcare for you?
Who would like to take that?
Right, I'll take a bit of that. There is only one country in the world which has put strong bans on the purchase of cigarettes, and that's Bhutan, and they lifted that during COVID. But no, there are no countries which currently ban cigarettes, and I don't see that happening. I mean, there are moves to say, well, everybody born after whatever year won't be allowed to smoke, or won't be, try to move the age upwards. It's still going to be, strong pressures to not to start or to, whatever. You've got a product which is currently legal in every country in the world. You've got, legal production of tobacco in huge number of countries. We've got this whole history of drug, attempts to eradicate coca growing in Colombia, and they've just arrested the most recent, big cartel guy, but, the next guy will be in place within, probably already. So you can't really ban something like smoking or ban tobacco. And that's why the tobacco harm reduction proposition is so much more attractive, because you're offering a choice. It's like, saying, okay, we don't want any more pollution, we ban driving. You can't ban some of these products, but you have to offer the opportunities to shift in a different direction. And I think that's what's so attractive about the tobacco harm reduction proposition, because it nudges people, it allows people opportunities to make those choices which lead away from something they don't want to do.
Let me just add a few caveats to that, though, because I am a little more concerned about this. I look at the history of international drug control, and if you ask the question, how was it that so many countries all around the world signed on to the prohibition of cannabis, even though many didn't even know what it was? There was a persistent pressure coming from the U.S. government, et cetera. And if you have a key government like the U.S. or others that begins to get behind a more prohibitionist campaign, I could see some momentum beginning to build. And then just two other points. Some years ago, we did a poll, public opinion poll. We asked people if they would favor in the United States a federal law criminalizing cigarettes within the next 10 years. And by and large, something like 40+% of the public said yes. But the highest group, with over 50%, was two groups. One were conservative Christians, and the other group was young people. Right, and the fact that young people were, were more and more accustomed to there being restrictions on cigarettes here and there, and they're thinking, here a ban, there a ban, everywhere a ban, let's ban the whole thing, basically. So I think we could see sentiment shift, and I think the last part of this is there's growing support, even within the tobacco harm reduction movement, for restricting the nicotine content in cigarettes to the point where they cease to be what we think of as cigarettes. And I think if that proceeds too far, where you're no longer allowed to sell cigarettes with any meaningful amount of nicotine in it, that will reduce the number of people smoking. It'll provide a shift to harm reduction devices to the extent it's available. But it also means when you're talking about 13% of the American population and maybe 13% of the global population or whatever it is, still smoking, that suggests to me that restricting the nicotine levels in cigarettes becomes something like a de facto ban, in which case one could see an explosion in the black market. I'm struck in tobacco control circles and even the harm reduction group that, coming out of illicit drugs, we're familiar with black markets, as I said earlier in my talk. But when people in tobacco control think of black markets, they think about something that's worth some billions of dollars around the world. There's some criminal organization involvement, not a lot of violence behind it. Big tobacco complicit in various ways in feeding their products into the black market. But if you go to the point of a kind of de facto ban by reducing nicotine yields, I'm concerned that you might see an explosion in that black market where it increases absolutely dramatically. And at the same time, when you look at the stigmatization and demonization of smokers, we know that has some positive public health effect in terms of discouraging young people. But, we're heading in a direction now where cigarette smokers are becoming as stigmatized and demonized as we typically thought about as illicit heroin users. So there's a whole range of things why I take everything Jerry's saying, I generally agree. But I say let's watch out for these variables out there.
This is an area I think you can probably maybe look a little bit to the industry on, because is it not recently that Philip Morris in the UK indicated that with the transition to less harmful products, it may be a place where it could actually remove cigarettes from the market. There's a lot of areas there, but there's a question here which I think is really important, and I want to make sure we do get it in. It's a question to Jerry. And it's, would there be a benefit to tobacco harm reduction advocates applying for access to the climate change COP, pointing out that the combustible tobacco puts CO2 and CO into the atmosphere?
I think no. I think the contribution of the CO2 to the atmosphere is probably pretty minimal. I did, when we had the CO2 crisis recently, with the lack of CO2 in the UK affecting food products and bags of crisps, I jokingly said every time you open a bag of crisps, a penguin dies. But the amount of CO2 coming from smokers, it's minimal. Nice move. But no, but clearly the issue is how do you get these voices heard at COP in in a couple of weeks' time, the voices are not there. I mean, many of us have been to COP and stood outside and, shouted a little bit. But, they ritually ban, they let people in, let the media in. They only have about 20 places for the public and, the media. And, the ritual thing every first day of COP is, I spy strangers, I spy, evil in the crowd and ban everybody. So
That's a recent thing from the last few years and continues.
Right.
But we have to remember that at the initial part, it is open until such time as there's a move to close it.
To ban,
now,
yeah.
at that point, countries can say, no,
Sure.
we don't want to close it.
Sure.
Now, there's an advocacy point.
Yeah, I mean, the point
governments don't have to close it, so I think we can. There's an opportunity.
Yeah, I don't think joining the climate COP, but I think
No.
there are avenues for exploring other bits of the UN system, particularly the human rights bits, to try to bring out some of the issues about human rights, access to safer products, and so on and so forth, which was used reasonably successful in the drugs field, where the human rights arguments were put to WHO and UNODC, and in fact led to harm reduction being adopted within the UN system for drug treatment, drugs. So I think there may be things to explore within the international system, but not necessarily at climate COP.
No. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. Now, I can ask the remaining 2 questions, but you'd have to all be very quick, or I can ask you alternatively to just say your last comments.
No.
Question.
Okay, questions, right. Are there any legal means to globally confront the opacity of the FCTC Secretariat and its exclusionary and anti-democratic character? Could this come from the UK, for example?
I think it should come from the UK, from Canada, from countries which have open standards about meetings and so on. I'm not sure it will. I mean, you mentioned that Canada stood up once on this. I think in the days of streaming and all the rest of it, there's no reason why these things shouldn't be open to all. But it will depend on a few countries pushing for the openness of the proceedings.
Okay, and I'll ask the last question. Why can't the WHO admit and inform openly that nicotine in itself is not what causes cancer? FDA does, but discreetly, unfortunately. It could save lives at no WHO budget at all. I guess, Ethan, that's probably one for
I mean, all I can imagine is that they think between, on the one hand, the conflicts and pressures from Bloomberg and folks like that, on the other hand, the fear that it will send the wrong message. If somehow you say nicotine is okay, people won't get it. I'm guessing, but maybe Jerry knows better.
Okay, well, we're at time, so I'm going to say thank you to all. Natalia for joining us from Ukraine, Jerry and Ethan, thank you, and thank you to the audience for being so wonderful today.